Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Assad. Welcome to a session on institutional racism in America. This is a session prompted by the last week's execution of a black man in the state of Missouri, Marcellus Williams, after the Supreme Court refused the defense lawyer's pleas for a delay in the execution. The um, uh, the fact is that this is not unusual. As we'll see, the rate of imprisonment of African Americans or blacks, if you will, is far higher um, in proportion to the demographic population of blacks, which is about 13%. The life sentences are higher. Um, the arrests of blacks versus whites are far higher. So the entire criminal justice system is in fact um, a reflection of a society which is historically with roots in the slave era before the American Civil War of 1860-1865. It is a society which institutionally and culturally is in fact what a number of sociologists call an apartheid society, and there has been scholarly literature comparing the United States with South Africa, apartheid South Africa. I want to just, as I feel obligated to say this as a historian who takes the long view of civilizations from ancient times, all civilizations around the world to the present. I want to point out that all civilizations from the first one, 3500 BC in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, to Egypt, to Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, Greece, Rome, all civilizations throughout history down to the present are judged not by military conquests. That is not civilization, that is destruction on a mass scale. Nor are they judged exclusively by artistic endeavors like art and sculpture and music and theater. Those are very important because they're an expression of the human spirit. However, there is ultimately the question in any civilization how how the elites that are in charge of public policy, as well as those in the private domain, how they treat citizens, how they treat people, all people, and not just a handful in society. And based on that criterion, we have in the United States a civilization which starts out, of course, the United States, it's no secret, um, was made up of, it was the colonies of Great Britain. Those colonies had a deliberate policy of expanding on the land of the native population, Indians, Native Americans, namely Native Americans or Indians, a policy which influenced, in fact, 19th century German intellectuals who developed the theory of Lebensraum, which means living space, a racist theory riddled with social Darwinism. The reason I'm mentioning this is because social Darwinism also played a role in the institutionalization of American apartheid, American racism, institutional and cultural racism, considering, by the way, that in the 19th century, there were actually books taught in school advocating that social Darwinism, a pseudoscience based on racism, was actually science. And this was done to justify the racist culture and the racist institutional structure. So, this is by way of introduction of what this society um, was all about. This is what it was all about. And we are going to take a look at this today. I'm going to start, in fact, with an overview, a historical overview, and look at various aspects. And then, of course, give you some statistics because I think it is easy to say, and for people who are well meaning, it is easy to say, well, the United States is, in fact, a society rooted in racism. And it is just as easy for someone who readily denies this um, and says, well, that's just reverse racism against white people. And this is the charge that in the last couple of decades has been made, especially since 2013, when the Black Lives Matter movement began. They were accused of being reverse racists. Um, and also those advocating the teaching of critical race theory at the college level, but also in high school, they were accused of being reversed racist. Well, you're offending my sensibilities as a white person. You're, in fact, a racist, not me, because you're bringing up uh, the legacy of the slave owning institutions and its impact on today's society. What does that have to do with me personally? So the this is an important issue in deconstructing racism and race culture, and of course, in the United States at the state level, because the U.S., of course, at the state level, state legislatures and governors have enormous power to determine race policy. The state of Missouri, for example, is one good example. The effect is that when you look at a map of the United States and see where executions takes place, it's predominantly in the southern states and in the plain states. So that's not an accident because those are mostly conservative states. I apologize. I'll turn this off. Um, the those are conservative states that the um, that have GOP representatives that uh, adamantly deny that there is institutional racism. They will argue that there is the old argument that goes back to the Reformation period when the slave owning institution started. We have a few bad apples, but not institutional issues. No apartheid, no institutional problem, no cultural problem, a few bad apples. It's that person over there, go get that person. Don't change the institutions, they're fine. Well, what I'm going to do today is, of course, provide everyone with some statistics. I want to ask Assad to start us off with some questions, and then I will begin, if you will, Assad, if you're on. Okay. Let me let me move on then. Let me point out that the Assad, would you like to ask start us off with some questions? Are you hooked up to the microphone?
Yes. Can
Okay,
you
go
hear me
ahead.
first? I need to
Yeah, of
confirm
course, I can
that.
hear you fine. I can hear you. Good morning, first of all. Good morning.
Yes, sir. Good morning. Good morning to all viewers who are watching this conversation, who are listening to it. It is very important. Recently, just about a week ago, Marcellus Williams was executed in the U.S. In a prison via lethal injection, and he was arrested. He was serving a life sentence for a murder back in 1998, and the victim's family had pardoned him. They didn't want him to be executed, but the state authorities still uh, proceeded with the execution. And many people think that it is racism. It is an example of racism. And similarly, back in 2020, during the COVID-19 days, George Floyd was killed by a police officer. And he was police officers had caught him because they believed that he was stealing something from a store. And the police officer, who was white skinned, I believe his name was Derek Chauvin, and he pressed his knee on the neck of George Floyd, and he died within a few minutes. So many people think that it is racism.
Absolutely, that is correct. It is the problem
Yes, and you
of
know that Black Lives Matter movement became a cultural phenomenon, and it became viral on social media. So these things are linked to institutional racism. So let's see how it. So let's see if it is racism or it is something else. And we have been seeing that racism acts in the U.S. Ever since Africans were enslaved by the white colonialists back in the 16th, 7th centuries and the 17th centuries. So, Mr. Kofas, it's important that we understand that if that racism is still exists in the American society ever since the days of slavery, do the Americans still perceive the African Americans as slaves, despite the fact that Barack Obama was the president of the U.S.? He was the first black-skinned president of the U.S. He was elected in 2009. So we need to confirm if the U.S. still perceives the African Americans or other races like the Native Americans, the Red Indians. They have been persecuted when the European colonialists invaded the U.S. back in 16th and 17th centuries. They committed a genocide of the Native Americans. So Asians have been subject to racism. Jews have been subject to racism. So there have been a lot of facts. So, Mr. John Kofas, now it's all your call. It's all up to you how you explain this to viewers. Thank you.
Thank you, Assad. I'm glad, by the way, that you mentioned Barack Obama because um, the fact is that Black Lives Matter started during the Barack Obama administration, 2013, after a white person killed a black teenager down in Florida in 2013. And this year, by the way, we have a black candidate for president, Kamala Harris. And this takes place in the state of Missouri. So the fact that I'm glad, and that's why I'm glad you mentioned this, the fact that there are black elites, and of course, this has been the case, especially since the Kennedy administration slowly evolving, doesn't mean and this is one of the things that people point out. So this is why I'm glad Assad mentioned this point. Well, there was, Barack Obama, and I have back in Washington, D.C., a number of very good African American friends who argued that, well, Barack Obama's presidency was of symbolic significance. And when I point out that he had a black attorney general, and yet there were police violence against minorities did not stop. There was, in fact, there were in fact a number of killings of blacks by police officers, um, and that this continued. So the question, and their answer, by the way, some of them, their answer is, well, he was the president of all Americas, which somehow implies that that justifies not offending the sensibilities of the majority population, of the white population. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is, well, okay, so you have a black president back, Obama 2 terms, and you have a black lady running today. Well, they are running for all of America, so they're not going to rock the boat, the institutional structure. Well, that's just the issue, that the institutional structure is at the core of this. It's the institutional structure. It's the idea, again, I stress, because many of the apologists, you see, of the institutional structure say, well, it's just, if you have a problem with that specific police officer, it's not the specific police, it's the culture. Those who have studied criminal justice in the United States know very well that it's the culture of police departments. It's their culture. They're racists. This doesn't mean that everyone, there may be, and I mean, I'm sure there are, there are individuals who are actually the exception, but in the main, and the institution is racist, and the uh, the acts speak for themselves. You don't have to be guessing on this, because you have repeated violations of the civil rights of blacks. It's just that simple. In other words, this is not this is not a guessing game where you have to speculate. You just look at the results. When you look at the results, this is what you have. Let me start with the idea of race. Let me go back to the idea of race. First of all, race is a construct. It's a human construct. There is no such thing as race. There is only the human race, period. It is not a scientific fact that there is race. Race is a human construct. The concept of race evolves with the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, the European transatlantic slave trade. There was no such thing as uh, race worldview before that. Going back, by the way, whether in the West or in Asia, no such thing. Okay, so let's just get that out of the way first. The question is, why did the Europeans manufacture the concept of race and build around it an ideology and a culture around it? And scholars, sociologists, historians, political scientists, etc., psychologists, and so forth, argue, economists as well, that it was because the white elite, influencing, of course, and determining the hegemonic culture, the dominant culture, wanted to convince the public that these people are inferior, therefore worthy of exploitation. Okay? So the fact is, the bottom line here is exploitation of these people, enslaving human beings, by the way, that white Christians were carrying out, is against Christian ethics to enslave other human beings. They had to justify it, and they got to the point in the United States, in fact, that whites did, that is, that they implied God wanted these people to be like this, wanted them to be slaves, and they deserve to be slaves because they were biologically, intellectually inferior and culturally inferior. The Kipling thesis, white man's burden. White man has the burden to civilize these savages. Who were the savages? The people who were enslaved, or those enslaving them? This is the ultimate absurdity of white Western mentality about racism, that they turn around and and call savages the people they run after. They capture them and use middlemen, African middlemen, capture them, enslave, put them on boats, and transport them to the Western Hemisphere so they can exploit their labor. And then they call them savages. This is the ultimate absurdity. And then they build an ideology around that and try to justify it. Well, they're inferior. Oh, okay, so they're inferior. Let's assume that, let's take that absurd assumption as a given. Does that mean that you have the right to exploit them? So that's what you're going to use to exploit their labor? You see, this is white European worldview, and it remains so, by the way, at certain levels. Today, with regard to immigrants, in both in Europe and the United States. Now, when the U.S. went to civil war in 1860, it did so because it needed, contrary to what a lot of people assume, it wasn't because the whites, and I lived in the United States for decades, and many whites assumed, well, you see, we whites sacrificed to free these people. See how good we are? Actually, it was a situation of the northern interests that President Abraham Lincoln represented, banks, manufacturers, import exporters, trade, who wanted to industrialize the United States. And they could not do this in the absence of a mobile labor force. No country in the world has industrialized in the absence of having a mobile labor force and reducing the percentage of people engaged in the primary sector of production, part of which is agriculture, so you can have those people in the secondary sector of production, in manufacturing, okay? So you can lower the cost of manufacturing and have a viable manufacturing sector and have industrial development. Those who have really studied the causes of the Civil War know this. And it wasn't out of humanitarian considerations. This doesn't mean, by the way, that they were not honest to goodness abolitionists who believed for moral considerations. And I don't want to dismiss that concept. We want to give them their due. But the idea that somehow this was an altruistic, this was necessary. In fact, American historians of the 19th century point out that the real revolution in the United States, and the word revolution, by the way, the word revolution means systemic change, wasn't the War of Independence. There was no systemic change other than national independence. That's it. Everything else, the status quo, the economic status quo stayed the same, the elite stayed the same. There was no revolution. There was no systemic change in the social structure at all. The American Civil War, according to American scholars, was the real revolution in the United States because it resulted in systemic change in the social structure, namely a social class, slaves, became free, except that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that were passed to guarantee their freedom were violated in the southern states, across the southern states, and that influenced the north through what were called black codes, namely legislation at the state level that essentially recreated apartheid conditions, not slave conditions, but just a step above. Okay. So what we have socially, politically, economically is a separate, a separate community here, created right after the Civil War because the Southerners refused to accept, and the Northerners felt guilty anyway that they had this Civil War, white brother fighting white brother, right, killing each other over blacks. That was their assumption. When in fact, that was not. There had to be a civil war, as Abraham Lincoln, who was, by the way, a very intelligent individual, as the president of the United States pointed out, this was necessary because it had to take place in order to move forward with industrial development. And in fact, when does the United States experience industrial development? After the Civil War, right? So when you look at why didn't it experience industrial development before? So when you look at industrialization of America, it's not before the Civil War; it's after the Civil War. Um, so that's to be said, and that's very important. Now, on top of the black codes, by the way, which create apartheid conditions in America and across the American South, you have in 1896 the Supreme Court of the United States in a case called Plessy. Plessy was a black man who sat in an area where whites were sitting in a railroad car. Plessy versus Ferguson, and the case was heard, and that legalizes Plessy versus Ferguson legalizes segregation. Segregation means apartheid, by the way, separate but equal. So everything from even a drinking fountain, where people drink water, for it, there were signs for blacks, for whites. Restrooms, blacks, whites. Everything was segregated. Housing, schools, everything. Churches, okay, across the board. So segregation was was not limited to one thing. This is what I mean by institutional racism. It wasn't limited to one thing. It was everything in society. It was a way of life. Okay. Now, historically, the scholars who have written on this, and there are many aspects, by the way, there are many, many, many books on this topic, argue that the beneficiaries of this were the white elites, not the working class, which bought the bait of the hegemonic culture, the white elites, that don't blame us, blame blacks for your condition. So the workers, just as they do even to this day, they turn against each other because they buy into the class warfare that the elites um, um, promote. They turned against the black because the blacks had to survive, so they took jobs that are lower at any salary, any wage, as they do today, by the way, making 24% less right now, let alone 100 years ago. Right now, 24% less. Okay? So what you have is the white worker going, yeah, that's my enemy. That black worker that took less money, so I'm paid less. And the capitalist comes across looking like roses, right? It's not me, it's the black guy. Okay? The If you follow the money, the trail leads back to the white elites. Political elites, by the way, that use the black vote to get elected, okay? and especially the socioeconomic elites that benefit economically by keeping wages down. So this group of people, Black Americans, were used to um, keep profits high, especially during the industrialization of America. But to this day, like I told you, right now, 24% lower. Okay. And right now, blacks are 13% of the population. They own roughly 4.3% of the wealth in America. 13% of the population. Okay. They own 4.3, 4.4, somewhere in there, from 4.2 to 4.4. This is a reflection of inequality at the socioeconomic level. Now, what fools a lot of people, and I want to stress this, is that you have people like Barack Obama, who is who ran for president and won twice. Well, you have a black president. What are you complaining about? Right now, Kamala Harris. Well, you have a woman, black. She's running for president. And it's true, there are people in elite positions. The Secretary of Defense is black. Some of the top brass in the Pentagon are black. Some diplomats, the UN representative the U.S. representative at the UN is black. So and then on Wall Street, you have some black billionaires and millionaires. Byron Allen, for example, in entertainment. You have black millionaires and billionaires. And they go, look at that person. Does that count for something? Yes, it does. Except that the 90% of the population, in fact, especially under the neoliberal model in the last 45 years, has actually seen a drop in their wealth effect. In other words, a drop in their income. Not that the entire working class of the United States hasn't. It's just that the blacks, have experienced it even higher. Okay. So this is a very important point. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention, and I have seen it firsthand because I lived many decades in the United States, that one of the successful strategies that white elites use to perpetuate apartheid, segregation, was to co-opt. They started even during the slave era, they had already started with that. And then they continued after. And they started with a very important place, the church. Blacks had no outlets in the slave era except one. Whites did not allow them to do anything except uh, have faith. In other words, embrace religion. So religious leaders historically, it's no wonder, by the way, that many black leaders have come from religious background, and there are still black leaders to this day who are from religious background. Obviously, the most famous is Martin Luther King, right? But Jesse Jackson, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, um, who, by the way, to his credit, is one of the few who was not co-opted and sort of not co-opted, and he has argued that okay, we have had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to undo Plessy versus Ferguson and the black codes and all that. However, we have seen a rise in inequality, especially sharp among African Americans. Okay, so this is well known. Those who want to know, they know it. Now, co-optation, seriously, to this day, and you can see it if you follow the political domain, if you follow the business domain, if you follow academics, that is, schools and universities, you see it in every domain. Co-optation of black leaders, black elites by the white establishment, and then having them manage the black community, placate them, not drift off as they did in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I don't know if people have studied this, but with the Black Panther movement, for example, or people like Angela Davis, decrying those reformist blacks who are co-opted. The co-optation was something that two major leaders of the 1960s also recognized. First was Malcolm X, not well known, not nearly as much as Martin Luther King, but they were contemporaries. Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were assassinated, by the way. Okay, we'll leave aside the speculation and conspiracy theories. I don't believe in conspiracy theories, but we'll leave it aside. Okay, they were assassinated. Martin Luther King was actually acceptable, and to a large degree still is. They have a Martin Luther King holiday. Hey, Black History Month and Martin Luther King, right? Because to a large extent throughout his career, he was one of those black ministers who went along with the co-optation route. Then, toward the end of his life, just like Malcolm X after he went to the Arab world and looked at how Muslim societies operated and and then examine further what was happening with race relations, that this was more of a class issue and that it was about political exploitation, economic exploitation, social exploitation, and it was larger. And that foreign policy of militarism was linked to it. And that blacks were dying in Vietnam, by the way, in body bags. They were being brought back in body bags during the Vietnam War in large numbers. When both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King veered away sharply from the reformist school in the black community and, you know, called things for what they were, and also took a class-based analysis perspective, they were both eliminated, both of them, out of the scene. The question, of course, is capitalism supposed to be colorblind? Is democracy supposed to be colorblind? Is an open society supposed to be colorblind? America claims to be all of those things, and yet it's not colorblind. Not at all. As Assad mentioned, the family of the victim in the 1990s of Marcellus Williams went along with the defense lawyers in allowing the defense attorneys to further look into the case and see if they can uncover more evidence regarding the possibility of the man's innocence. The Supreme Court, never mind the governor of Missouri, the Supreme Court would not hear the case. This is not atypical. The criminal justice system of America, just like the political system of America, the entire institutional structure is really solidly under the control of the white elite. And they co-opt and use part of the black elite to project the image, the very hollow image of an America that's pluralistic, open society, democratic, when in fact that's not the reality. That's far from it. Um, I'm going to give you some statistics at this point. 13% of the population in the US are blacks. They own, as I said earlier, about 4.3, 4.4 of the wealth. Whites are 65% of the population. They own 80% of the wealth. Blacks earn 24% less in income than whites. The poverty level of blacks is 18%. Of whites, it's 7%. The unemployment of blacks is close to 7%. Of whites, it's 3.3. Okay. Home ownership of blacks is 41%. Of whites, 73%. College graduates of blacks, 45%. Of whites, 70%. Life expectancy of blacks is on average 5 years, and when you exclude black women, it rises. It's much higher. Then we come to the criminal justice system. Blacks are 31% of the prison population, although the 13% of the general population. 40% of all inmates executed are blacks. 48% of all life sentences are those of blacks. Now, let me bring up a case that was, excuse me, that exposed racism at the institutional level as reflected in the criminal justice system. It is well known that the United States consumes most legal and illegal drugs in the world as a percent of its population. It's not a secret. Okay? This is not just a supply issue, as experts in narcotics and legal drugs point out, but it's also a consumer demand issue. It's part of the drug culture. The culture, as one of my former colleagues called it, the culture of therapism. Take drugs, take medication, no matter what. Now, in 2007, a major pharmaceutical company, the Purdue Company, by a very wealthy family, by the way, I'm not going to mention it. The Purdue Company, behind which is a very prominent billionaire family, admitted, pled guilty to promoting OxyContin, which is a dangerous narcotic. But they made billions. They had made billions. They paid fines. The company went bankrupt. No one went to prison from the company. No one went to prison. A small-time black dealer, whether teenager or not, a small-time marijuana dealer, okay, goes to prison. A large-scale promoter of OxyContin, and companies trading on Wall Street right now, trading marijuana on Wall Street right now, are hailed as business miracles. How wonderful. These business geniuses, their business is marijuana, by the way, okay, on a large scale. Yet, a black teenager or in the 20s, in the 30s, doesn't matter the age, right? Will go to prison and do hard time for selling a tiny, a tiny portion of what they're dealing. So what you have is a criminal justice system which rewards the capitalist on a large scale. I don't even want to mention banks laundering drug money and having been fined by the Department of Justice for money laundering of drug money. There have been stories, especially down in South Florida, by the way, that a number of banks down there, if not all of them, a number of banks, and the real estate industry down in Florida is has been thriving because of the illegal drug money coming in from Colombia and Mexico and Latin America. So what you have here is a clear case of the mainstream capitalist cashing in on a mass scale, while a small time an individual who happens to be black, who is involved in part of that on a very small scale at the neighborhood level, is used by the criminal justice system as an example. We're tough on crime. Really? This is tough on crime? Putting putting some small time dealer and allowing large banks and pharmaceutical companies and corporations, all those people, the executives of all those people, to do business as usual. They pay the fine and they turn around and do the same thing, by the way. So what we have here is blatant hypocrisy and the manifestation of a system that is intended, as scholars, by the way, who do work on this, make no bones about it. And let me bring up critical race theory, by the way. Many scholars who do honest work on this use critical race theory. When critical race theory started to be promoted, especially after the Black Lives Matter movement back in 2013 became important, and there was an immediate right-wing reaction against Black Lives Matter, but also liberals, by the way. Critical race theory became an anathema, not just with conservatives, not just with far right wingers, but also liberals in the suburbs. They didn't want their children to feel badly that their white ancestors, they said, well, we have nothing, we're slave owners. Um, Although the purpose of critical race theory, let me tell you, because what I'm doing today is, in fact, using critical race theory as part of the structure, not entirely, but part of the structure for this presentation. Critical race theory is not a mystery. It doesn't mean anything but using a structural approach. I use a structural approach for everything. If I were to analyze anti Semitism from the Black Death to the present, I would use a structural approach. And so do other people, by the way. Other scholars do the same thing. Why is it acceptable to use a structural approach when analyzing anti Semitism in its historical context from way back in the 14th century, right? The Black Death to the present, to the Holocaust and to the present, but it's an anathema when it comes to blacks who were transported by the millions from Africa, a number of them killed along the way or shortly after they arrived here, or while they were here, not here where I'm at, but in the Western Hemisphere. Um, and then they were subjected to subhuman conditions, living conditions. They were treated subhumanly. They were not treated as human beings. There was no social justice, and that is at the core of institutional racism. That is at the core of critical race theory. Where's the social justice here? Many black scholars point out that there was a social contract as reflected in the Constitution of the United States, but it did not pertain to blacks. It pertained to whites. After all, when that Constitution was drafted, there was slavery. And even after the Emancipation Proclamation, even after the end of the Civil War and the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, state legislatures circumvented the law, found ways around it. Not to mention the Ku Klux Klan, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, by the way, in the late 19th century, and then rising again in the 1920s, okay? And then various far right wing racist organizations to this day, okay? Critical race theory is a way of explaining to students and to the public that this is not a case of there's one bad racist over there, let's just focus on that person, and there's another over there, but the rest of us are fine, and there's nothing wrong with the system, okay? When in fact it's the system that's the problem, that creates those bad apples. It's the entire system. This is a systemic problem. And that's all critical race theory is. And yet, even suburban white school districts in democratic, heavily democratic areas resented and resisted the teaching of critical race theory. Okay. I have a few minutes to conclude and to make a few comments about this. The the most serious issue, in my view, again, having studied, having taught, and also having experienced institutional racism in America, is the division in the black community, the successful division that the white elites have managed to uh, carry out because they have co-opted a segment of the blacks, a small percentage, co-opted them. You want to be successful, you want to have that nice house, you want to have money, you want to have a nice car, you want to have a good career, you have to follow the system. The system is the one that is based on racial discrimination. By the way, the media projects an image that everything is fine. This is a pluralistic society, that there is pluralism. Okay, after all, the person presenting the news is black. How can there not be? How can there not be pluralism when the person delivering the news is black? You see? So tokenism, that is getting token blacks for certain positions, elite positions, has been a successful strategy by the hegemonic culture to perpetuate institutional racism. And this is a tragedy because when I see a black woman and a black man representing the United States at the United Nations Security Council defending apartheid in Israel, I can't but think of how they would defend apartheid in that country when they know better than me. I'm a white European immigrant. They know better than me that apartheid has a long history in the United States, and yet they are the most effective tools in perpetuating that system. And that's the tragedy. Now, I don't believe, by the way, and Jesse Jackson was right, that there will be, Jesse Jackson was right about the rise of inequality among blacks under neoliberalism. Um, I don't believe there will be a change anytime soon. On the contrary, I want to broaden this out and conclude by arguing that race, I have always taught and written about race as an integral part of the class structure. Um, it's true that the social contract did not apply, that the white social contract did not apply to blacks in the United States. That's absolutely true. Black scholars are correct in arguing that. They're right. However, what we have here is that the white elites, the capitalist class, and the representatives in the political arena have been using the race issue. They have been using the marginalized community, black community, as part of warfare to detract and distract people, distract them from class warfare. And that has been successful as well, especially during neoliberalism, when class warfare has been at the core of the neoliberal model of privatization, deregulation, corporate subsidies versus welfare subsidies. So this is not, I don't see this ending, I don't see it subsiding. I think that the entire neoliberal model would have to give away to something, a political economy, something more geared towards social justice. That I see race in America, race relations in America improving. I see race becoming less of an issue once the entire social contract moves away from the current political economy model of neoliberalism. I invite your comments, your questions. I ask you to subscribe to this channel. Assad Lim is managing this channel. It's an educational channel. He does an excellent job with various topics. I thank you for joining me. And until next time, I I'm hoping the next topic will be, I had promised to do this, is the German topic of Lebensraum from 19th century to the Third Reich. So thank you very much for joining me.